Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here and thanks for checking out my podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the notification bell for new episodes. You can also find Shine Without Shame on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Well, it is a beautiful day in the neighborhood. My friend Dena is with me. Dena Bermann is a licensed marriage and family therapist with experience providing therapy to children, adolescents, adults, couples, and families. She utilizes a client-centered, strength-based, relational approach focusing on creating a safe therapeutic environment for her clients to help them feel understood and achieve their goals. Dena always considers how the influences of race, culture, gender, and environment affect and impact an individual, couple, or family system. Her work has predominantly focused on child development and in community settings with children and youth impacted by disrupted attachments in their family system caused by trauma and abuse. Dena is also a trained dancer, choreographer, teacher, and lover of the arts. During the pandemic, Dena rediscovered her love of puzzles, sitting in silence, going on weekly bike rides with her 74-year-old father, and creatively executing ways to safely be together with friends and family. Thanks for joining me, Miss Dena.
Thanks for having me.
It's so good
Nice
to see
be
you.
here.
Yes, I'm happy.
It's been a minute.
It has been a minute. And I'm happy to know that the pandemic has offered some brighter spots. It's, I'm sure, been challenging like it has for everybody, but it's nice to know that you're still finding the joy in life.
Yeah, I think it took me some, I think the pandemic took me away from that for a little while. Like you kind of get lost in the, like, just what is even happening. And I think in the being able to reflect back on the 2 years, I think that there have been really some lovely moments and beautiful moments of slowing down and breathing and kind of like going back to the basics of just of life and living and what matters and what's important to you. So I think there were definite blessings, despite, I think, all the worry and fear and sadness. And, I think that there's always the darkness and the light, I think, are constantly in conversation with each other.
That's such an interesting way to articulate it. Yeah, and the way you described your reflection on the last couple of years, it relaxed me. So it's always it's always good to get grounded and have that perspective that there is positives and there's the challenges, but we're here. I guess we're here for both. So thanks for
and
sharing.
maybe if you had asked me this question a year ago, I might have had a different response. So I think that there's also that, like, we really only have the now, right, to reflect what happened. And we are we are who we are in the now because we've lived through what just happened. So if you had asked me a year ago, I would have probably answered differently because I feel like I'm partly a different person, I was a year ago than I am today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's so much truth in that. I'm curious, Dena, what have been your just general observations in your work when it comes to shame and people's experience with shame? Is it super prevalent in your work in terms of what people are going through?
Yeah, I mean, shame is such a, I think can mean many different things in many different spaces. And so I think when I think of shame and I think what tends to happen, at least in my experience in working um, with people, I mean, especially with children, it's interesting how shame comes up for people at different like develop ages and different developmental stages, right? So if we're talking about an adult, let's say, I think the thing that I feel like shame comes up for people when an experience or a situation or a feeling about something is lacking integration in their story, in their narrative, right? It's not integrated into who they are. So if there's something that has happened to them or something they did, let's say, that they feel bad about, I guess I become curious around, you know, how people decide to share their truths, right? With maybe, you know, family members or friends or just living in the community in which they exist. So I think that there's a connection to when someone is living in shame, I think that they're lacking integration in their story.
Would you say more about like, or maybe an example, just a general example of that integration? Is it that there's the whole truth isn't being kind of
It's like,
represented or
it's how much,
acknowledged?
yeah, it's like, how much ownership how much ownership can I take? How much responsibility am I going to hold? Sometimes people feel shame for something that they haven't done, but maybe they were associated with or a part of in some way. Sometimes people feel shame about, let's say, their family history that they had, like, you know, generations ago. Maybe something happened in their family that they're not, you know, directly connected to, but it's like part of the family story. So I think there could be like levels, and you know, it's like what is it, the 6 degrees of separation. Right? I think I kind of see it sometimes as like, am I directly impacted by a person or an experience or a feeling about something, or is it how many times removed is it? And I think sometimes when a situation is further removed, it might be easier for somebody to talk about it. I mean, not always. And I honestly, like, you asked kind of you asked an interesting, well, I'm just thinking of, sometimes people don't really know that what they're holding onto is shame about something. I think sometimes it tends to come out it comes out in behaviors, right? It comes out in, let's say someone, you know, is defensive or aggressive or gets, you know, is irritable. And it's like this trigger, right? It's like this trigger and kind of what sometimes sends people in like this shame spiral of like, oh, they're gonna know, they're gonna find out something. I don't want them to know it's like this, and how is it going to impact me or negatively impact me? So I think that there's also, I think mirroring, I think, is really interesting in the work that I do with people, because I think sometimes when people feel shame about something, they might try to reflect that back on me or back onto somebody else, because it's too painful or too hard for them to carry themselves.
Right. Yeah, especially if it's been with them for a long time, I imagine.
For a long time. It's so varied, I think, because I find that it's easier, I think, to work with, I don't want to say easier, because nothing ever feels 100% easy. I think sometimes, like when I'm working with children, right, and they feel, maybe we might use the word embarrassed, or they feel like they're going to get in trouble if they talk about this thing that they did. That kind of falls in the shame category, I think. But I think with kids, I think, helping kind of set a precedence, especially as like a person, like a helper, a feelings helper, right? I usually say to the younger children that I work with, that they're never in trouble with me for anything that has happened. And so kind of trying to say that and to remind them of that. And I have to remind them of that constantly, because I think sometimes there's so much pain in something negative that has happened, and it gets acted out in these real maladaptive ways. I think a lot of times what we're all, human beings are, I think, seeking, really seeking love and acceptance, I think, at its core. And so when things happen and people are not happy about the outcome in whatever capacity, I think unless you have like a personality disorder, right? We can talk about, people who have like narcissistic tendencies or borderline, personalities, or, I think it's harder for people who present in that way to, I think, be able to be reflective about their own stuff. So they might not even live in places of shame, because everything is so forward facing for them. But I think when we're talking about people who, might be experiencing anxiety or depression, or, they're struggling in attachments, right? Like in connecting with their parents, or there's been, relationships that have been broken, right? There's so much that can get stirred up. And I think for children, the shame part, I think, tends to live in the space of like, am I going to be in trouble for this thing that happened? I think for adults, it's, I think, a little bit more, complicated, or, something happens for children that's like completely out of their control. Parents make a decision about something, or something happens to the child that the parents didn't protect the kid from. I think I don't think that there's no one good answer. I don't think.
Yes. Well, yeah, it is. It's complex, as you're saying.
Complex.
It's very
Yeah.
multifaceted.
Yes.
And something I've explored here in terms of even the word shame. I mean, I've talked about it with people who do have, training in therapy and counseling, but I've also just talked with people who have an interest, like they've been working on their own development and healing. And one kind of aspect of this big conversation with this podcast has been acknowledging that shame, I guess, has a place in society, but usually in my observation, it's when something really egregious has happened, in terms of maybe a crime or something that's really major. And then shame can serve as a tool to change behavior.
Yes.
But I know that there are people who are in like the counseling, therapy, healing world who actually just in general don't think shame is good. And I'm not saying it's a great thing. Hey, but I again, like, I think it has a place, but what I've been so interested in exploring through this podcast is the idea of shame when it just like stays with us, when we're never really able to either be aware of it affecting our lives or kind of shake it off of us. That long term, it's one thing when something really major has happened and a person needs to be held accountable in a way that's serious, like it requires some sort of intervention. I understand that it may be present at that time, but again, for the kind of the everyday life stuff that we all deal with, it doesn't seem like shame is helpful in the long run. And especially when it lingers, and especially when it's subterranean and we're not even where it influences our behavior, but we're not even registering that. And something you said when you were starting to explain, how you've observed shame and in your work, how it can affect all different kinds of people at different stages of life. And something you said made me think of accountability, because you said the idea of having a story, but not always maybe having all parts of the story or all the information. So sometimes that made me think, oh, sometimes that's right. Sometimes we are shamed or we feel shame, but it would be interesting to think through, well, how much of it do I actually need to take account for, if any? Sometimes people are just shamed and there really is nothing that needs their attention. But I suppose there are some aspects, or even just, as a friend or as somebody who maybe you've offered to do something for someone. This is an example I always think of, or you've committed to something. Someone's asked you, can you do this? Or would you show up for this? Or would you come through for and do this? And you drop the ball for whatever reason. It could be a lot of different reasons. And I've thought through in my own life, sometimes, and I'm thinking of my own personal decisions, but also I'm thinking of other people in my life. I think sometimes we make commitments, we make decisions that we don't really want to really make, but we feel pressure, or we just feel like, oh, this is going to make me look bad if I say no. So we say yes, but we're not really wholehearted about it, or we're not committed. And then we end up dropping the ball, which then can cause, not always, but it can cause a whole host of other problems, right? If you're talking about a relationship of some kind, whether it's professional, whether it's a friend or family member or community member. And that I've thought through that aspect of maybe when shame does kind of come in, and
Mhm.
the idea of being accountable. And it may be in those
Mhm.
cases, maybe if a person were to reflect, a person who dropped the ball, say if they were to reflect, maybe they would say, okay, yeah, I said I was going to do this and I didn't let the person know, or what have you. So, okay,
Mhm.
I'm going to hold myself accountable, and I'm clear about my part. But sometimes I think those kind of dynamics, the water can be really muddy, and it's not clear like who should be accountable. I mean, or how we need to hold ourselves accountable in situations where there's, some sort of agreement or commitment. And I think
Mhm.
for a lot of
Mhm.
people, I think that probably will be a familiar scenario. I think we've all
Mhm.
been in those situations, whether we're on one end of that or the other. And I've been thinking about accountability. And then you were talking about people's stories and, you know, trying to understand, or trying to help people get clear. Maybe that's part of the work in terms of what they need to take ownership of and what they don't actually need to take ownership
What
of.
they don't.
I was just curious about your
Yes.
thoughts about that. I know it's a big concept, accountability, and then the, slash ownership, but I'm curious what you think.
I think it's hard to know what you are truly accountable for when you don't have a clear idea of like what happened. And so, I'm thinking I can use I feel like maybe it might be helpful to use a personal example.
Sure.
When um, you know, I didn't have, I didn't really have my own therapy experience, like going to therapy for myself, until I was, I think, 32 years old. So didn't have a therapist as a child. It wasn't something that was really talked about in my family. Um, parents were married for, I think 22, 23 years, but divorced. So there, family, family split. And, um, and I'm just thinking about my own experience of, it really wasn't until I was able to reflect in my own work and my own therapy process and my own slowing down and reflecting on like what happened, B, understanding not just like my story or what I thought happened, but having conversations with my parents as an adult, having conversations with my sister who was also in the same house that I grew up in, and putting pieces together that where I felt like I was trying to put a puzzle together and I didn't know like what picture I was making.
Hmm.
And so, and I'm getting to the point of this accountability because I think what started to happen in my own work and my own therapy and healing is, sometimes it takes somebody outside of your story, outside of your family system, to say to you, that wasn't yours to hold. You're not responsible for what happened to your parents. You're not responsible for why didn't this happen or why didn't that happen. And I think, and this has been such a delicate dance in my growth, not just as a human being, but even my growth as a therapist and doing this kind of work for a living, is coming to a place of understanding So then I know for myself what I am accountable for, what I'm responsible for, and knowing when to back off. Because that piece of the story is not mine to hold. Or that feeling, yeah, I have feelings about it, but it's not mine to carry. And so, but it really takes a slowing down and a really like truly getting to know who you are and what parts in your life you were just along for the ride for, but you were impacted by it. And I think until we can do that process for ourselves, I think it can get so easy to feel like where the lines are blurred. It feels more murky. It feels more blurry of like, why am I having this feeling? Oh, well, it's like if you haven't done the work in processing what happened, how can then you say to yourself, oh, wait, that's not mine. Okay, I can kind of then clear whatever's going on. And I'm not saying we don't get triggered or stirred by our surroundings and the people in our environments, but it takes a slowing down and a listening to say, and reminding yourself that we are truly only responsible for ourselves and really truly only accountable to ourselves, and I think how we show up in the world. And we can't do that for other people. We can't, and I think it's hard when we also can't have the same expectations because other people might just be in different learning phases in their life. So it's tricky, but I think, what I have found to be most helpful for myself and my healing is really coming to understand my story, my triggers, what gets me going, what sends me over the edge, however you want to phrase it, like what, the phrase, like, I just get, someone says something and I'm just like off to the races with whatever gets, stirred up in me. And then I have to slow down and think like, it's really not about this other person. It's really about what's happening for me in that moment. I think also, when you're able to see where and when you hold yourself accountable, I think it becomes easier when someone else is maybe like coming at you with something. You could say, whoa, and you can like kind of say in your head, maybe you wouldn't say it to them directly, but you might say, oh, like that's their stuff that's getting stirred up, not mine to take on. And I think it's the again, the balancing act of like this delicate dance of like, what's mine, what's yours. Sometimes, when we're in relationship with someone, even if it's, a parent-child relationship or a romantic relationship or a friendship, there's always going to be this delicate dance, this balancing of what's mine, what's yours. And when we can feel, I think, safe and comfortable in sharing what's mine, what's yours in that relationship, I think then it becomes easier to navigate when there are disagreements or disruptions, I can say to one, a best friend or a good friend of mine, we get into something and I have a reaction. I can usually, when I've calmed down, I can usually go back to that person and say, oh, that was that thing that happened. It wasn't you, but I had my own reaction, right? That's taking ownership. That's taking responsibility. That's not placing blame on somebody else. That's you're holding yourself accountable in your relationships, not just with yourself, but with the people that you care about.
Dena, thank you for sharing this. This is so powerful, and it's really heartening to hear about your journey. I mean, I know you've shared some of it with me personally, but to share it with other people, I'm sure will be helpful to them. And thank you. And it's an honor to be your friend and to know you're on this journey. And we're all on our journeys, but it's not easy always to get through these breakthroughs, but you've done it. And something you were just saying at the end about, the dance, the delicate dance, and the idea of ownership and knowing who owns what in any given circumstances is important. And I think when there is that reciprocity and that mutuality in the willingness, and it doesn't always come easy at first in whatever kind of relationship, but hopefully it will evolve to a point where, say if it's two people, it's that you both get to a place where you have that trust and there's that safety where you can say, yeah, that was something that I had a hard time with that, or I did not enjoy that experience, but let me explain why. I'm going to process why. And sometimes I've learned sometimes the accountability leads to an apology, but sometimes it does not lead to an apology. That's what I found really interesting as well. And I think sometimes there is this idea of like, well, if I'm accountable, then I'm just giving in and saying, yeah, it was all my fault. I'm the bad person, or it's all on me. Or even if it comes to a point where maybe one person was, for the majority of the situation, responsible for some sort of deterioration or something negative. But so I think sometimes there's fear and kind of a hesitancy to be accountable because it may make you feel so vulnerable, and it may make you feel alone, like, oh, it's all on me. The idea though, relationship, it's never just on you, but it doesn't always mean that, you have to apologize. I guess if that's what's, probably necessary or most appropriate, then an apology is, or an admittance of like, yeah, I'm sorry, that was my bad. But I've learned that sometimes it doesn't come to that, but I know why it can be scary to even start down that path, because like, well, wait a minute, is it just going to be me out there on my own? Or is this person going to not even take like some responsibility, but are they going to allow me the space and the grace to be honest, to be truthful, and to be vulnerable, and not just say, well, see, I told you, or see, you always do that. Or, I mean, we've all been in those situations and been on either end of that, receiving and giving. But I value what you just shared in terms of your journey and your understanding of, your own history and how you want to participate in it as you've learned more about yourself and what you need to take ownership of. I think that's the ideal in my mind, is that more of that unfolds in relationships, and then the people involved will mutually want to participate. And it's not always about tit for tat. You're wrong, I'm right. It's like, but let's process. Let's share what happened, how we played a role. And again, like, if an apology is needed, then then let that be. But it doesn't always lead to that.
Mm-mm. And I think like we're not always going to get it right. We're not always going to get it right the first time, the third time, the 10th time. You know, like I think that there's also allowing yourself some grace in the process of it. You know, because I do think like I do really believe, and maybe this is my I say like what I'm about to say, because despite I think my irritations with people, and I think it tends to be more like strangers or like just like people who are living their lives and don't feel like I run into people where I'm just like, yeah, you're not really thinking about others in this moment, are you? Right. So like that's a different thing. But I do really believe, I think in general, that we're doing the best we can with the tools that we have in the moments that we are living in. And I think most people are not malicious, and most people are not trying to hurt and harm, and yet still hurt and harm happen. And I think that's where I've been able to, I think when stuff happens or stuff gets stirred up in my life, if I can kind of get back to that place, then I feel like a softening or I can find empathy, right? I can find empathy for this other person who is really struggling, or whatever the situation is where I was affected by it. But also knowing that most people are not trying to be malicious and trying to be hurtful. So I think holding that, those parts, I think really allows space for understanding. And if it leads to an apology, like you're talking about, I don't think that is always, like you said, is always going to happen. And I think when you have the expectation that somebody should apologize to you, I don't know that that's really what you're looking for. Like, you really want somebody to apologize when they don't mean it? That doesn't feel good either.
Right.
So, and sometimes it takes the timing and the understanding of, whatever that other person is going through, right? That timing might look very different than your timing of how you feel like you're ready to reconcile, or you're ready to have a conversation, but that other person isn't. And I think that's okay. But then, is there room and is there space? Is it important to you? Is the relationship important enough to you to wait, so that maybe that other person can come to a space of like, okay, I'm ready to talk about what happened? And that's really hard.
It is. And I appreciate how
And
you're, oh, go ahead.
well, it's hard. And I think if that person, if the relationship is important enough to hold space for really the unknown, or for some healing to happen, or for a conversation to start, or an ability to reflect. Sometimes it takes a while to like get out of the feelings of it, right? When we can let those feelings settle, when we can not feel so hurt about what that other person did. I think when you try to have conversations too soon, sometimes it's just like one person, another person, you're kind of going at it because you're on the defense. You're playing sides. And it doesn't really allow for a lot of listening. So it's, it's tricky. It's, I think, timing. I think it's, I think the apology, apologies, I think when it comes from an authentic place, I think it comes from, it's got to come from a place of not just I'm sorry, but I'm sorry for this, and being able to articulate what this is, right? Because people can just say, oh, I'm sorry. Well, what are you sorry for? And if they haven't done the work, then I think that they're going to continue to say, well, if I just say sorry, that's going to push the shame away. That's going to like rectify it. That's going to move it along. But if you're not ready to deal with the actual, like what you are sorry for, that piece of the shame that I think we get stuck in when we've done something to possibly hurt might have hurt somebody. Then those apologies don't feel authentic to me, in my opinion.
Yes, I concur. And I like the way you've teased this out. The idea of time and the idea of the value of the relationship. Because I know personally I've maybe in the last 5-10 years, I've started to get clear about what I'm willing to allow in terms of this particular struggle, in terms of the time it may take for someone to become accountable, and when I'm willing to allow it and when I'm not. I've gotten clear about that. And there are times when there is a relationship. It's not to say that I don't value it. I usually want to value it so much, but sometimes I've recognized, and I don't know the whole story, and it's not my business necessarily to know the whole story, because this wasn't necessarily like a person I'm, a deep friendship or someone I've known for a long time and have that track record with. But I've recognized that for some people, they have a deep wound that for whatever reason hasn't really gotten the attention it needs for the healing to happen. And so maybe we've crossed paths at a point where there's still, and again, I don't know all that's going on. I'm not presuming to know the whole story and to get like into someone's business, and I'm not trying to be someone's therapist, because that's not my training. But I think I know people well enough, and I know from my own life experiences, like, I get a sense that this person has a deep wound, and it doesn't seem, just based on conversations and behavior and comments they've made, it doesn't seem like they're addressing it. And sometimes I understand these are heavy, deep, powerful, traumatic wounds. So
Mhm.
I'm
Mhm.
not dismissing, and I appreciate how it can take years, sometimes lifetimes, to heal some of these wounds. So I acknowledge, but sometimes I happen to cross paths with these people when they're still right, like in the kind of the dark with it. They haven't necessarily been able to start that
Mhm.
healing actively, consciously. And then I recognize, because
Mhm.
they can't hold themselves accountable just in other aspects of life in terms of like a relationship. um I recognize when I'm involved, like, okay, I don't think I can stay for this. Not because I don't care, and not because I wouldn't be
Mhm.
willing to show up and give my best, but I just get the sense, it's not out of judgment. It's just out of this sense, like, I don't think this is coming anytime soon for them. And I don't think that would be the kind of relationship and the kind of dynamic I want to be a part of. And I've made those decisions.
That you're
And
wanting or that you're needing. Mhm.
yeah,
Mhm.
and unfortunately, in some of those cases, there was never even a conversation about like why the relationship ended. It just fizzled away,
Mhm.
because I knew that I trusted my instincts, and I thought, I don't, even if I bring this up, they're not even ready to hear it. Sometimes maybe once I sensed that that person was ready to hear it, but most of the time when it's that deep of a wound, usually the
Mhm.
conversation isn't ripe to be had. So in my case, when I'm thinking of these one or two experiences, I've just walked away from those relationships. There was no drama, like there was no drama, there was no anything. And the way I always look at those situations, I've said this here on the podcast, if I walk away or if I detach from the connection, which may not have been a very strong one to begin with, and the other person doesn't turn around and say, "Hey," then it seems like it was meant to be. We're kind of both, without having the conversation, we're both on the same page. And those are the kind of
Mhm.
situations I'm like, that I'm grateful for, like, because there was no need to have drama. There was no need to like be confrontational. It just,
Mm.
the relationship wasn't going to develop further, and
Mhm.
it was unspoken, but we both just sort of said, yeah, okay, nope, we'll move on. And
Mhm.
it's interesting
And
how that happens sometimes.
well, and I think not every relationship is meant to be with you for always. Not, sometimes relationships you part ways and you reconnect with that person 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later. I mean, you never know.
That's true.
Um, there's sometimes there can be reconciliation, and I think it's like really dependent on timing and if the interest, you know, sometimes it can be as simple as, I don't know, you run into each other randomly, right? And some years have gone by, I think, um, and sometimes endings are true endings. Sometimes the endings, the walking away is the ending for you. I think those all can be true.
Yeah, yeah. I appreciate you reflecting that. And in at least one of these situations, I'm thinking it wasn't even that something happened between us that, like, I wasn't wronged in this one case I'm thinking
Mm.
of. It was just
Mhm.
that I just
Mm.
noticed in like kind of every area of their life, not even just with me, but with kind of everybody, there was this lack of accountability. They just really couldn't take ownership for any of their behavior, or very little of
Mm.
it, if that makes sense. So it was kind of less about they did like an affront to me, that it was just like, oh, this is just kind of where they're at in their life.
Mhm.
And I think I just need to let them go. So yeah,
Let
and
them go.
and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
but what you're saying is, I think is absolutely true. If there was something that was actually, directed at another person in the relationship, and it just didn't get resolved. And down the road it can. And that's beautiful. That is beautiful. Absolutely. But in some cases, I just think, no, I'm good. I'm good with that being done. It was just like,
sometimes it's okay to be like, like the tiptoe backwards.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I'm good. I can.
Yeah. Nobody notices you when you're leaving somewhere when you walk backwards. That's
when you walk backwards and you like slowly close the door behind you.
Yes.
Yeah. I'll see myself out now.
It's just so interesting. And I share what I'm sharing because I have to believe a lot of people have been in these situations, whether it was from the perspective I just shared or from the other perspective. I think these are very common dynamics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think at the root of it is there probably is some shame involved, but I think there is this idea of accountability and what that means and what that looks like. Accountability doesn't have to mean sacrificing ourselves at the altar of truth or friendships.
Yes.
It can be something really simple, really mild, and where you're not like tearing your heart out and putting it on a plate for someone. That doesn't have to be what accountability is. In fact, I would say best if it's not. This is just like daily accountability. We have to check in with ourselves. Like, how did I do today? That situation, that didn't feel so good. Let me review that. Or, that interaction, I could have said that differently. I mean, I think it's these little baby checks or like tweaks. If we were able to do them every day, it just makes it easier so that when we get to a big kahuna or what feels like a big kahuna, we're not just like, we're not piling it on top of all these other shameful or like hidden, feelings that we have about something we're not doing well, or something we did, we handled poorly, or something we experienced that wasn't positive. It's like the daily accountability, just the micro checks, I think is what can really help us. And I think the more we do it, the more we hold ourselves accountable, like in private. That's what I'm thinking, like that, those kind of daily accountability checks can happen in private, right? At the end of the day, or maybe in the beginning of your new day. But then there's also the accountability that happens in a conversation, in an exploration with someone else or other people. But I think in terms of the kind of the outward accountability, there is something powerful in that. I wonder what you think about that in terms of if you continue to hold yourself accountable in your relationships. Maybe there are going to be some people who are just really, they can't meet you there. They just can't meet you. But I think it encourages other people. It kind of is, it almost kind of models to other people, this is how it can be. It doesn't have to be destructive. It doesn't have to be like self annihilating. I mean, there's a healthy way to do that. We can all participate in our relationships when it comes to being accountable. And I think the more we let it manifest and we see it as a valuable thing, then it also encourages those around us to join us in that kind of work and that those, in that process.
It's interesting, as you were sharing that piece about accountability and like reflecting about one's day, or thinking about a conversation you had. I even think like so much of the work that I do with children and families is reflecting about what happened in my session, right? So there's a replaying of not just what someone said, but the behaviors and the interactions that you are observing within the family system. And sometimes, I will say not sometimes, a lot of times, I feel like, even therapists don't always say and do the right things. So there's a piece of this too that I think in the work and what I've learned over the years is how important modeling is for children and families. Like when something happens in a session in real time, and I say something or do something, and maybe it impacts the parent, and like you see them kind of shut down, or something happens and the kid just gets dysregulated, and you're like thinking to yourself, like or what I'm thinking to myself is, okay, well, that didn't go as I had planned or thought in my head. I think, and we call that like in therapy land, we call that we call it like a tear in the alliance, and in your therapeutic relationship, there's been a rupture or a tear in something that was done or said. Now, what's interesting, and I'm using this example in this, like in a therapy session, because I think that it really does also apply in real life too. Like, I'll think about what happened and reflect about, I might have said this thing that might have set this parent off or shut them down, not intentionally, but that's what happened. And I think the thing that I think in modeling and helping families understand is that, I will usually come back the next week or the next time I see this family and say, I'm thinking, I was really thinking about you guys last week and what happened in our session. Like, we had a really hard session, and sometimes families can kind of go back to that time and say, oh yeah, such and such happened. And other times, I think what we're trying to do as therapists is model this, I might have said something that might have hurt your feelings, and I'm not sure, but I want to go over it with you again. Are you open to that? Right? And there's this allowing space, possible space for repair in the relationship, in the alliance with that person. And I think that's where the healing happens. Healing doesn't happen in the you did this and you did that. It's healing happens in somebody circling back to that person to say, I was really thinking about you, and I might have said something that may have hurt your feelings, or that wasn't my intention. Are you open to talking about it? Are you open to maybe I need to give you some clarity on where I was coming from? And I think in that, we're modeling, hopefully, what parents can do with their children, right? Because parents aren't going to always get it right with their kids. And it allows space, I think, for parents. I think not enough parents apologize to their children. And so, and it's not because they're doing something intentionally to them, but the kids are picking up on or feeling something, and they can't articulate what's going on because they're too little.
Right.
So there's this, like, that's where I think, like, I am, as a therapist, constantly thinking about, okay, my own accountability in the work and in the sessions that I'm in with these families. And I think, the more we practice something, it's like, the more exercise we do, the stronger we get, kind of a thing. It's like the more that we practice and use these muscles, the stronger and the more secure I think we will feel in saying, oh, wait, okay, that was mine. I'm sorry. And really owning it. And I think when we can do that, I think that's when like shame doesn't have a place to exist, because we're just like, we're in the business of just of being honest and truthful.
Yes, so well said. And thank you for sharing, your own experience in your work and how you've held yourself accountable. And it's like, I like how you said you compared the process of holding yourself accountable and or modeling that it helps clients and everybody involved in the alliance, as you said, to practice what accountability looks like and speaking up for yourself and it's like practicing, I think, but it's like after a while, the practicing doesn't really, it's not, I mean, the practicing still is the real thing, that's what's so powerful.
Right. No,
that's
true.
What's so powerful. It's like
Yeah.
if you can kind of like tell people, just practice it, but really you're probably,
it's more the doing. Yeah. Maybe the word is less practice and more of like the doing of it.
Yes, no, but I thought that was perfect. No, I'm saying let's keep the word practice in, because it's kind of like a wink, like, just practice it. But it's like, but you're really actually doing it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But because sometimes practice helps people. If you use that kind of language, it helps people not feel like, so overwhelmed, right? It's not as big of a deal, maybe, or as scary. So I like that you're using that language, because I was like, oh yeah, that's really good, to encourage people, whether it's you in your work, but I'm just thinking in general in life, how we all can say, let's just practice this. But it's like, no, we're actually really doing it, but it just sounds less intimidating. It sounds less intimidating, right?
Yeah.
So I value that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there is something really, I think there's something really true, the saying, I think when, I don't know, at least this is my own experience. I feel like, each year I get older. Each year I'm learning, I'm growing. I do feel more wise, right, about the lived experiences that I've had and the lessons that I've learned from those experiences. Now, I say that with the caveat of like, I'm always looking for the lessons, right? If something happens, or I'm not in this way of, the saying, and I don't know if I'm a believer of the saying, but like, well, whatever happens, or whatever, will be kind of a thing. And I'm not here to say that I'm just like, it's important to have, I think, direction, right? And it's important to have wants and needs and desires, and to try to work towards whatever is going to, bring you joy, right? Or bring you happiness. But I always am looking to find what the lessons are, no matter, maybe it's an experience that didn't happen, or something that I wanted that didn't happen. Maybe that was a protection. Maybe that wasn't really the path that I thought it was. And I don't know why I started talking about this, but I think
your wisdom has led you to this understanding.
Yeah. But I think that there's, Yeah, but I think that in these lessons, I think is also where my growth and an understanding of like where and how I hold myself accountable, right? How am I going to show up in this work or in this life or in this relationship? I see it as like an active choosing, that I'm not just letting things happen, or you just like, right, without there being like taking responsibility, taking agency, taking the reins, right? So that you're just like not like flopping all around.
Yeah.
But there's a, you know, even holding yourself accountable, like to your life. What do you want your life to be? Who are you going to let in? Who are you going to let go? Right? That's being accountable for every decision you make and every action you take and the feelings you have.
And it sounds like maybe you're also saying that as you've gotten older, you've learned to honor that about yourself. And also you
And to
mentioned this,
trust that.
yes, to trust yourself, to honor what you value and what you're willing to have in your life, who you're willing to have in your life. And there's some control in that, you know, there is an active, intentional participation in the process, even though there's a lot that we don't have control of in the world. And I can see how that would come with wisdom and you know, with you have a lot of willingness. That's what I see in you, a lot of willingness, even if it's not always been easier, like, hey, yeah, no worries, you know, to do your work, to do your healing work, to do your self awareness work. It takes a lot of, it doesn't just take honesty, but it takes that willingness. And so I think for someone like yourself who's had that, who's had those qualities and those elements on your journey, it does it, not that it's always going to be perfect, but you've been practicing, you know, your muscles, those muscles are more developed. And so it would make sense that as time moves on, you would be kind of building on everything you've been learning about yourself and life. And the other, how could you not come to a place of honoring yourself and trusting yourself? Those are beautiful tokens on the path. I just had like a video game. I am not a video gamer, but I just had a video game vision, you know, get those tokens, Dena. And I think there's something also to be said about those of us who, it's not about ego, but the people in the world who have learned to do this fairly well, whether you want to say mastered it or not, whatever, but have enough experience in this realm of you know, growth and again, self-awareness, that who can then model for other people in all different facets of society and all different levels. You know, there are some people who can do that on a, you know, a global level or an international level, and some people who do that in their community. You know, it's doesn't really matter, whatever people are called to, however they're called to express this. I think it's important. And I think that's what, you know, elders in communities and in cultures all around the world, that's what they serve as. They've had so much experience to learn and to grow. And part of that, you know, while they seem so wise, especially toward the end of their lives, if they're honest with people, they'd say, I made a lot of mistakes. You know, it's not that I haven't made mistakes or that I haven't dropped the ball or I haven't messed up, but it's that I've continued going and I've learned and I've adapted and I've evolved. There's been change, there's been progress. And I think more people need to hear that and see that. And again, it's those people in the world who can be those kinds of examples and models. It's not about ego, but it's just about them being who they are and sharing that and not being afraid. I guess that's an aspect of the podcast, shining, like, this is who I am, and this is what I have to offer. And what you're sharing about your journey made me think of that. Oh yeah, the people who are really good at this can, again, in whatever ways and on whatever level of society, we need them to kind of step out a little bit. And it doesn't have to mean like, hey, look at me, but we need them to step out in a way where people will pay attention and say, oh, wow, that's how it can look. Okay, I see. So, as a therapist, you're able to do that in your work. And I'm sure in other ways and other areas of your life, you can do that as well. But it seems so powerful, Dena.
Yeah. And it's tricky. You know what I'm thinking about? I don't know if I want to go down this rabbit hole, but I think it's so, it's been very prevalent in my mind, I think, as I've gotten older, and I think as social media has become such a big component of like what might feel like for some people like a showcasing of like, look at my life, right? Look at all of the good parts. I'm going to show you from this very specific like perspective about what my life looks like. And it can get really tricky, I think, for I don't know how to say it without sounding judgy about, because I think that there are really a lot of great parts about social media. And I think that there are parts that I think can get and can feel damaging for some people in terms of, if we don't feel, I think, strong and confident, right, in the things that we're doing in our lives, it might feel like what we see on, Instagram or Facebook in terms of like what people are showing or portraying their life to be, is not, I guess I kind of take it with a grain of salt, but I think that there are, it can get a little tricky when we think, oh, such and such person really has it together, or such and such person is like, look, they're doing all these amazing things, but it doesn't always allow for, we're all making choices about how people might see or interpret our lives. So I think that there's, take it as you may. I think it can get tricky for people who might not feel so good about their lives or might not feel so good about themselves. And then they're on social media, and then they might have this like negative kind of, mirror facing or like reflection on like, oh, like I'm not in a good place. Like, look at what so-and-so and such are doing. Where am I at in my life? Right. And so there's like what is it? The comparison is the thief of joy. Yeah. We can easily get into this comparing of what others have or don't have. And, is that going to take away from what we might have that just looks different?
I hear you. And this is something I've discussed here in this space a lot, this idea of competition and the idea that we compare ourselves to others in our lives. And it's it's very, I think, dangerous to do that. Although we all do that. We all do that on some level, even subconsciously. Sometimes it's hard to avoid.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, there's a lot to say about the competition part, and my
Mhm.
nutshell of it all is that, it's impossible that anyone can ever live your life, and vice versa, right? No two snowflakes are ever alike. And
Mhm.
while people can inspire us and maybe even on some levels motivate us, that only can take us so far. That's we still have to find out, well, how do I want to make that look in my life? If someone's doing something that isn't of interest to me, how do I want to,
Mhm.
and I want to incorporate it into my life, then how can I do that? Then, but I mean, there is certainly an aspect of social media that's just more superficial. It's just about lifestyle, and it's more the material side of
Right.
life.
Right.
And when it comes to
Right.
deeds, like what I was talking about when I was like people who I was, it's interesting that you were sort of, without saying it, you were talking about influencers, even though you didn't use that word. That's what I thought of. And when I was thinking, and you're very, astute to observe that. I don't think it's being judgmental. I think you're just observing it. And I'm sure, no doubt, it comes up in your
Mhm.
work, especially with young people. So the social
Mhm.
media aspect,
Mhm.
and the harm that can come from it, or just the challenge. It's not always harmful necessarily, but I'm sure it creates a lot of
No, but
challenges
it's
for people. And so that's
yeah.
interesting how
Yeah.
you were connecting to what I was saying, because I was like, oh yeah, I'm thinking about influencers. I'm thinking of influencers who are about modeling deeds, who are about modeling their action and how they contribute to the world in whatever way. And
Mhm.
it's like, you're right. So much is reflected on social media that's about, maybe there's some action involved, but a lot of it's about the material aspect of life. And there's only
Mhm.
so much in terms of
And
deeds.
the presentation of it.
Oh yeah, of course it's going to look good. It's always going to look good. But there's
Mhm.
so much about, the expressing deeds, or reflecting deeds, or modeling deeds, or good behavior or actions online is challenging. There's only so much you can get
Mhm.
from an online, even if someone is being authentic and genuine. There's only so much you can get from an online experience, unless maybe it's like, I don't know, a documentary, if it's a longer form, like really exploring someone's environment or their life. So it makes me think, how much could I really, how much how much can I get from observing someone's life online that will actually give me, not just inspiration, but like help me sharpen my tools. Because
Mm.
at the end of the day,
Mhm.
it's like you need to have your tools in your toolbox ready to go. And that can be creative tools, that can be all
Mhm.
kinds of tools. And I think that would be a question I would ask if I was, like you said, looking at social media. I would take it with a grain of salt. But if I was somebody who was influenced by social media, but maybe wanted to be a little bit more reflective, I would say, okay, yeah, I can be inspired. Great. There's a lot
Mhm.
of inspiring things happening, but like, what can I take from watching this person that actually is going to help me on my journey and move me forward? There probably can be things that, and you can find, and people you
Mhm.
can find, but I don't think that's behind every door. So I'm with you. It's I think it's, while life seems to be lived online, there's nothing like, being in like community with people, whatever that looks like.
Mhm.
Community looks like so
Mhm.
many things to people, but there's
Mhm.
nothing like, because that's when you can really see what it looks like to be in action
Mhm.
and to be living life. Like, people can still sort of present their best, you know, put their best foot forward, or kind of present what they feel is like the like socially acceptable um aspects of themselves in person. But at least there's a couple filters that aren't there also on top of all of that, right? So
Mhm.
I think authenticity needs to be authentic no matter in what space you're in. That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Agreed. I agree.
And so I'm with
Yeah.
you. It's so powerful and so influential, and it's not going to go away. So it's like we've got to evolve in a way that actually still allows us to value ourselves, grow and develop, and sure, be inspired, or you get excited, but by what we see online, but
Mm-hmm.
we still have to answer for our lives, and we're done with our
Mm-hmm.
lives. So
Mm-hmm.
let's not hang up the coat too soon. Let's live our
Mm-hmm.
lives. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm with you.
Well, well, and I just like
So
when you were
nice.
saying, like you were saying, the influencer, like the influencers and the thinking about it in the realm of deeds. I do think, like, look, we can be influenced by a specific author, or poetry, or music, or dance, or art, like those are all influencers as well, right? Like the creative life, the expressive life. That's, where are we moved, right? Like where do we get moved, and where do we move?
Mm,
And so I think that we can't live in this life and not be influenced.
that's right.
And unless you live under a rock somewhere. But even there, you might find some
Nature or something.
special nature or something. Yeah. um so yeah, maybe social media is not to shed a negative light, but I do think that there are positive aspects of that way of how it's used and how we are influenced by it. But I think it's like one part of the many parts, or the many ways that we are influenced.
Yes. And I think we can all be okay with sharpening our sense of with like our discernment. And I don't, again, this
Discernment.
isn't about
Mm-hmm.
judgment, but it's about, well, what is really going on here? Like, what is there something meaningful or substantial that I can take away? Like, and if not, okay, well, maybe I'll just move on to something that is, like you said, that speaks to you, that inspires you. I think it's okay with I think it's okay
Mm-hmm.
if we acknowledge that we should get better at discernment when it comes to observing people in the world. And again, not from the place of judgment, but just getting clear for ourselves. What's the truth here? And then you can make a decision about how you want to interact with that person or that community or what have you. And that's
Mm-hmm.
online and
Mm-hmm.
offline. I think that's
Mm-hmm.
always an
Mm-hmm.
important part. Like, how can I fit into this community or this space? I want to make sure I can, you know, be my authentic self. So
Yes. Yes.
I think it's okay if we all just accept that that's an important, quality to sharpen and develop. But oh, I could chat with you all day. I think we've chatted so much. I have lost track of everything. I've so enjoyed this,
Mhm.
Dena.
Me too. Me too.
Well, I always end by asking my guest, and I'll ask you now,
Mhm.
which television show, new or old, do you recommend and why?
I have two answers for you, and I
Mm.
can't decide which one to go with.
That happens here.
Has anybody said that? Has
Oh
anybody
yeah,
said that to you?
absolutely.
And do they share two, or do they just
Yes, I
share
say
one?
just go for it. If you really can't choose, then share both. If you think it's worth sharing, both of them.
I think I think I need to share both because well, yeah, I think these are two newer shows, or
Mm.
newish shows. Um One of them I'm partial to because it was like my pandemic show. Like I started watching it, I think, before the pandemic, and then I was like, the pandemic hit, and then I just binged everything I could, and then when the last season came out, like I watched it in real time. So it has like a special place in my heart. So Schitt's Creek is that show, and I think initially it was like one of those shows that was like really hard to connect with the characters, and I was like, just felt like, oh, they're so annoying, and they're so this, and they're so that. And I don't know what happened, but like sometime by like season 2 of the show, I started to like really create space for like empathy. Like I felt really empathic towards these characters, and I just think it was just funny as hell. So I think that there was like a part of like the humor of it that really like got me through the pandemic. And I think like towards the end of the show, like the things that I think initially bothered me about these human beings were the parts of them that I really like were really like, what's the word? That you just felt like, oh, that's just part of who they are. Like that's just their thing. I think I had like a soft spot for those parts that I think I initially felt annoyed by. And so I thought it was like, I think the reason I like that show is I think it also, I saw an evolution in myself, right? About where I was placing judgment about someone or something. And in the course of like this TV lifetime, like this TV life, I got to a different place with these characters. So I don't know, I just thought it was like my own ride of like the feeling parts that I think just opened up about these fake real people.
I get it. I get it.
Yeah. And then the other show that I just think was so beautifully written and so beautifully developed. And I think is This Is Us. And it just, like it was such an amazing journey to like how they told the story of this family from like start to from birth to death. And I think of the work that I do, I think it was just relationships are hard and families are hard, and we don't always get to choose those people. And so I think there was just such an honest and realistic storytelling that transpired in this family that didn't feel forced and didn't feel it wasn't like the reality TV of a sharing of a family, but like a real, I don't know, it just was like just amazing writing, amazing. That I think that I think everyone can probably find a character or find a storyline in that show and connect to it in some way. So I think that was, and it was so upsetting. It just ended this past season, and so I think I was feeling a lot of sadness around that as well. But really sweet show.
So I'm with you. Thank you. Those are two good ones.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks again, Dena. This has been very enriching, and I hope it was meaningful for you to share and to, have this conversation. So thanks for joining me here.
Yes, thanks for having me.